He saved lives to be a hero, and when that wasn't enough, he took them. Richard Angelo was born to parents deeply rooted in education. His mother, an economics teacher, his father, a high school guidance counselor. From a young age, Angelo exhibited a profound desire for recognition and admiration. He became an Eagle Scout, seeking approval through achievement, and after graduating high school in 1980, he volunteered as a fireman. Every act, every effort, seemed to be motivated not by selfless service, but by a craving for praise and validation, a compulsion that psychologists would later identify as hero syndrome. Richard Angelo, known as the Angel of Death, worked as a nurse at Northport VA Medical Center on Long Island, New York, during the late 1980s. On the surface, Angelo appeared to be an average, competent healthcare worker, someone who had chosen a profession to help others. He was known for his calm demeanor and reliability, traits that made him well-liked by his colleagues. Angelo's colleagues trusted him. Patients felt safe under his care, and his reputation as a dedicated nurse helped him blend into the hospital environment without raising any suspicion. However, beneath the surface, Angelo was not interested in saving lives. He was interested in the power that came with life and death situations. Angelo's primary motivation for becoming a nurse wasn't to care for others, but rather to be seen as a hero. And in order to achieve this twisted sense of heroism, Angelo began injecting his patients with muscle relaxants to induce near-fatal crises. He would then step in to rescue them, positioning himself as the savior of their lives. Angelo's ability to hide his dark side behind the facade of a caring nurse allowed him to evade suspicion for a significant period of time. The psychological fragility that led him to take these extreme measures would eventually result in multiple deaths, exposing the horrifying truth about the man behind the white coat. Richard Angelo's first confirmed victims were patients who were already vulnerable. Many of them were elderly or suffering from serious health conditions, and their sudden deteriorations appeared to be the result of complications related to their illnesses. Angelo's method of attack was both simple and effective. He injected his patients with succinylcholine, a muscle relaxant used during surgeries, which would cause respiratory arrest and lead to a life-threatening crisis. These emergencies were often witnessed by hospital staff, but they were not immediately linked to Angelo's actions. The suddenness and severity of the crises seemed to be natural complications, and Angelo's quick response to save the patients earned him the admiration of his colleagues. He was often the one who would perform life-saving interventions like CPR or assist with defibrillation, and the patients who survived would thank him for his heroic actions. But it wasn't heroism that Angelo sought. It was validation. Each time he saved a patient, it was an affirmation of his own self-worth. He enjoyed the attention and praise he received from his colleagues, but he did not hesitate to cause these crises just to be in the spotlight. Angelo later admitted that he would inject patients with the substance when no one was looking, then eagerly wait for the crisis to unfold. Once the patient's condition worsened, he would rush in to intervene, basking in the glory of his quick actions. As the years went by, Richard Angelo's actions became more frequent and more deliberate. The number of suspicious deaths and medical emergencies began to rise, but it was only after a certain number of them that the hospital staff started to take note. While many of the patients Angelo was responsible for were already in fragile health, the frequency of their sudden collapses, coupled with the fact that Angelo was present during these crises, raised concerns. By the late 1980s, at least 10 patients had died under Angelo's care. though the true number of his victims remains unclear. He had become adept at administering the drugs without leaving traces, making the deaths appear to be natural complications of illness. Many of the deaths occurred during his shifts, and after each crisis, he would act the part of the hero, rushing to revive the patients he had made sick. Angelo's increasing confidence in his actions meant that he grew bolder, often inducing near-fatal crises in patients without hesitation. His colleagues, still unaware of his role in these emergencies, continued to praise him for his ability to act quickly and save lives. What they didn't realize was that the very person they trusted to help was the one causing the harm. When Richard Angelo was finally arrested, the full extent of his motives became chillingly clear. His goal was not to kill, but to be seen as a hero. Angelo confessed to deliberately injecting over 30 patients with life-threatening doses of drugs, causing them to experience cardiac and respiratory crises. His rationale for these actions was simple. He wanted to be recognized for saving his patients. By inducing near-fatal crises and rescuing them, Angelo was able to create a false narrative of heroism that elevated his status in the eyes of his co-workers. Psychologists who studied Angelo's case later suggested that his actions were driven by a need for attention and validation, often associated with narcissistic tendencies. Angelo had a deep need for admiration and approval, and he sought it in the most dangerous and manipulative way possible, by risking the lives of his patients. His actions were not motivated by malice or a desire to kill, but by the need to feel important and revered. The idea of being the angel who swooped in to save lives was a source of immense satisfaction for him, even at the cost of others' suffering. This psychological profile of a hero killer was not just disturbing. It was a reminder of the potential for twisted motivations that can exist behind the image of someone sworn to care for the vulnerable. Angelo's lack of empathy and self-serving justification for his crimes exposed a deep-seated need for recognition, no matter the cost. The investigation into Angelo's actions began after several suspicious deaths occurred under his care. Nurse Susan Schock, who worked with Angelo, became suspicious after noticing a pattern of near-death experiences and sudden collapses among patients during his shifts. Schock started to track the incidents, and the evidence pointed to Angelo being involved in most of the crises. Her reports eventually prompted an internal investigation, and hospital administrators began reviewing patient records and death reports. In 1989, authorities were finally able to gather enough evidence to arrest Angelo. During questioning, he admitted to causing the medical emergencies and confessed that he had deliberately induced them in order to gain attention and admiration. His cold demeanor and lack of remorse during the interrogation revealed the extent of his narcissism and the extent to which he had manipulated his co-workers and patients for years. Angelo was charged with the murder of 2 patients and the attempted murder of several others. He was convicted in 1993 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his trial, the full extent of his crimes came to light, and the psychological profile of a hero killer was explored in depth. His case revealed the vulnerability of the healthcare system, where someone in a position of trust could exploit their authority and use their medical knowledge to cause harm. Angelo's ability to move through hospitals undetected for so long raised serious questions about how deaths were investigated and the role of medical staff in spotting the early signs of a serial killer in the healthcare system. For the families of Angelo's victims, the trial brought a sense of justice. but it could not erase the horror of knowing that their loved ones had been at the mercy of a man they trusted to care for them. The trial and conviction were a small measure of closure, but the impact of his actions on the hospital, the medical community, and the victims' families would resonate for years. The case of Richard Angelo remains one of the most chilling examples of a hero killer in modern medical crime history. His actions left a lasting impact on the healthcare industry, prompting reforms and a re-examination of how hospitals manage personnel and investigate suspicious deaths. The case highlighted the dangers of placing too much trust in professionals without proper oversight, and the psychological vulnerabilities that can lead someone in a position of authority to abuse their power. For the families of his victims, the tragedy was compounded by the betrayal of trust from someone who was supposed to help. Angelo's case serves as a reminder of the dangers that can exist within trusted professions and the importance of vigilance in identifying and stopping abuse before it reaches catastrophic levels. The legacy of Richard Angelo will forever be tied to the dark side of heroism, where a desire for admiration and attention can push a person to commit heinous acts under the guise of saving lives. Richard Angelo was a hero-turned-killer who craved praise. But our next subject, a fellow LPN, was even more prolific, suspected of causing over 100 deaths. What no one realized was that the hospital's most reliable nurse was also the one creating a graveyard in its hallways. Orville Lynn Majors was a licensed practical nurse, LPN, working at the Vermilion County Hospital in Indiana during the early 1990s. To the outside world, Majors was just another healthcare worker, providing care to the patients who relied on him. He had a calm demeanor and a reputation for being reliable and hard-working, at least on the surface. For his co-workers, he was just another part of the team, and his actions went largely unnoticed until it was far too late. Majors, like many nurses, had access to vulnerable patients, most of whom were elderly or seriously ill. His position granted him the opportunity to affect his patients' lives directly, but it also allowed him to carry out a series of murders over several years, all under the guise of medical care. At first, his actions seemed unremarkable, until the bodies began to pile up. What made Major's case so disturbing was the chilling fact that he deliberately killed patients whom he considered demanding or whiny. His reasons for murder were not about financial gain, but about his desire to rid himself of what he saw as inconvenient patients. Major's first confirmed victims were patients who died under strange circumstances, many of them in the intensive care unit or the cardiac ward. Most of these patients were already in critical condition, and their deaths were initially written off as natural causes, complications, or even expected outcomes of their illnesses. But as the pattern began to unfold, it became clear that something far more sinister was happening. Major's method of killing was relatively simple yet terrifying. He would inject his victims with lethal doses of potassium chloride, a drug that can stop the heart within minutes. These injections often appeared to be administered when the patient was either sleeping or unconscious, making it difficult to detect. What was even more chilling was Major's behavior after the murders. He would often stay near the patient's bedside, watching as they slipped away, and sometimes even attempting to resuscitate them, thereby positioning himself as the hero. The deaths were soon noticed by some of Major's colleagues, but by then, the number of victims had begun to grow. His calm and professional demeanor allowed him to avoid suspicion, and the hospital administrators were slow to connect the deaths with his actions. As the number of suspicious deaths continued to rise, Majors' pattern of killing became more evident. Between 1993 and 1995, at least 6 patients died under his care, but it's believed that the actual number could be much higher. Some estimates suggest that Majors may have killed as many as 130 patients during his time at the hospital. However, due to the failure of the hospital to properly investigate these deaths, the full extent of Majors' actions was not fully understood until much later. What made Majors' killing spree particularly disturbing was the cold and calculated nature of his crimes. He didn't kill out of passion or rage, but rather out of a sense of entitlement. He believed that the patients he killed were demanding or whiny, and in his mind, their suffering was justified. Majors later admitted that he found some of his patients' requests for care to be irritating, and he began taking matters into his own hands. The hospital administration continued to overlook these deaths, attributing them to natural causes, until a pattern began to form. Majors was the one constant in each case, present during the critical moments of his patients' final hours. Yet his reputation as a reliable and hard-working nurse shielded him from suspicion, and his actions continued unchecked. Majors' chilling motive was eventually revealed. He murdered his patients because he found them irritating or demanding. His reasoning was disturbingly simplistic. He saw those he killed as obstacles to his peace of mind. If a patient needed too much attention or complained about their care, Majors would deem them as whiny or problematic and take action to remove them from his life. He would make them die in ways that appeared to be caused by their underlying medical conditions. His justification for these killings was based on a deep-seated sense of frustration. Majors would later admit that he found the repetitive nature of his job dull and tiresome. The patients who required constant care and attention became, in his eyes, a burden, and he began to take matters into his own hands. His actions were not driven by anger or emotional outbursts, but by a cold, calculated desire to eliminate what he considered an inconvenience. Psychologists who studied Majors' case after his arrest suggested that he suffered from antisocial personality disorder, with a complete lack of empathy for his victims. In his mind, these deaths were justified, even necessary. He wasn't just eliminating patients. He was ridding himself of individuals who, in his view, didn't deserve to be alive or who made his job harder. The investigation into Majors' actions began after a nurse, Kathleen Major, began to notice the rising number of sudden and unexplained deaths among his patients. She became suspicious after noticing that Majors was often present during the critical moments of the patient's emergencies. As more deaths occurred, the hospital administration was forced to take action. An investigation revealed that the deaths occurred predominantly during Majors' shifts, and the patients were all under his care. Hospital records, patient histories, and interviews with staff members began to paint a clear picture. Orville Lynn Majors was the common denominator in these deaths. In 1995, Majors was arrested after evidence confirmed that he had administered lethal doses of potassium chloride to several patients. When confronted with the evidence, Majors admitted to his crimes. He confessed to killing his victims because he found them demanding and wanted to rid himself of their presence. He had no remorse for his actions, seeing them as justified and necessary. The police discovered that Majors had been using his position as a nurse to kill without anyone noticing, hiding behind the trusted image of a medical professional to carry out his murders. Orville Lynn Majors was convicted of the murder of 6 patients, though the true number of victims remains unclear. During the trial, the prosecution revealed the full extent of Majors' actions, detailing how he had used his position to carry out these murders over a period of years. His lack of remorse and cold demeanor during his confession shocked both the public and the families of his victims. Majors was sentenced to 60 years in prison for his crimes, though many believe that he killed far more people than the 6 he was convicted of. His case highlighted the critical failure of hospital administration in recognizing patterns of suspicious deaths and raised serious questions about oversight in the healthcare system. Majors' ability to move from one hospital to another, leaving a trail of death behind him, showed just how vulnerable patients can be when those meant to care for them are the ones causing harm. The legacy of Orville Lynn Majors is a haunting reminder of the potential for abuse in the medical field. His case exposed the dangers of a lack of vigilance and oversight in healthcare settings, where someone like Majors could continue his killing spree for years without being stopped. Majors' ability to manipulate the system and evade detection is a tragic commentary on how easily a trusted professional can slip through the cracks. For the families of Majors' victims, the pain of losing their loved ones was compounded by the knowledge that they were betrayed by someone who was supposed to heal them. The legacy of Majors' crimes has left a lasting impact on hospital policies and protocols, pushing for greater accountability and vigilance in medical facilities. Orville Lynn Majors will forever be remembered as the angel of death of Indiana, and his case remains one of the most chilling examples of a nurse who exploited his position to carry out horrific acts. It serves as a reminder that those we trust the most with our lives can, in some cases, be the ones who end them. Majors' killing spree lasted for years, but a nurse who worked across multiple hospitals and whose crimes went largely unnoticed for a decade and a half would become the ultimate angel of death. With a body count that may never truly be known, they called him a dedicated and compassionate nurse, but behind a quiet, unassuming demeanor was perhaps the most prolific serial killer in American history. Charles Cullen was a nurse who worked across several hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania over a 16-year career, gaining a reputation as a dedicated and competent healthcare professional. His demeanor was calm, and he appeared to be a reliable figure in the hospitals he worked at. Cullen's quiet, seemingly unremarkable nature helped him blend in with his colleagues, which made it easier for him to move from one hospital to the next without raising any alarms. While Cullen presented himself as the archetypal compassionate caregiver, he was hiding a dark secret. Behind his uniform, Cullen was one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history, suspected of killing up to 400 patients during his career. What makes Cullen's case particularly disturbing is not just the sheer number of victims, but how he was able to carry out these killings with relative impunity. Despite a long history of suspicious behavior, Cullen was able to work at numerous hospitals, often leaving a trail of death in his wake. His case would expose the systemic failures in the healthcare industry and the dangers of ignoring red flags when they appear in a trusted profession. Cullen's killing spree spanned nearly 2 decades, but his first confirmed victims were patients who died under his care at St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey. He was often assigned to intensive care units and emergency rooms, where he had direct access to patients in critical conditions. Cullen, using his medical knowledge, would inject his victims with lethal doses of medications like digoxin or insulin. substances that could easily be mistaken for normal treatment at the time. His method was slow and calculated, leaving minimal physical evidence behind. Many of Cullen's victims were elderly or in critical condition, which made their sudden deaths appear to be a natural progression of their illnesses. Cullen's ability to administer fatal doses without immediately being detected made his actions all the more chilling. He created an environment of death that seemed almost natural, making it difficult for others to see the pattern in the rising body count. While Cullen's first few murders went unnoticed, there were suspicions raised by his colleagues. His presence at the bedside of patients during their critical moments seemed too consistent. But the system failed to investigate properly, allowing him to continue his work unhindered. Over the years, the number of suspicious deaths began to grow in hospitals where Cullen worked, but the administrators and medical staff repeatedly failed to connect the dots. At Morristown Memorial Hospital and later at the Somerset Medical Center, Cullen continued his killings, moving between hospitals and evading serious scrutiny. His ability to switch from one hospital to the next, often using forged credentials or lies about his past, was made easier by the hospital's failure to check into his background properly. The more deaths Cullen caused, the more his actions seemed to go unnoticed. Hospital administrators and co-workers viewed the deaths as natural, especially since Cullen had a reputation for being a quiet, reserved nurse. When the cause of death was unclear, it was easier to dismiss it as complications from the patient's illness, rather than considering the possibility that a nurse could be intentionally causing these emergencies. Cullen's killing methods were varied, but often included injecting his victims with insulin or digoxin, both of which could cause cardiac arrest. He would then wait until the patient was in critical condition, often watching as they died, before rushing in to revive them, basking in the praise of his colleagues for his quick actions. But when the patient's condition worsened again, they would die, and Cullen would move on to the next victim. Cullen's motive was disturbingly clear once he was apprehended. Unlike many serial killers who are motivated by power, anger, or a need for control, Cullen's actions were driven by a combination of factors. He described his motive as a desire to end the suffering of patients, but this reasoning was deeply warped. Cullen, in his mind, believed that by ending their lives, he was relieving them from their pain, though his actions often caused unnecessary suffering. For Cullen, the act of killing became a means of coping with his own psychological struggles and inner demons. It was a way to regain control over a life that had been marked by personal turmoil, including a difficult upbringing and a history of depression. Cullen seemed to view his victims as mere instruments in his quest for power and control over the lives of those he deemed helpless. The psychological toll of his actions and the way he justified them painted a chilling portrait of a man who had detached himself from reality. Psychologists who studied Cullen after his arrest noted that he exhibited signs of antisocial personality disorder, with a complete lack of empathy for his victims. He would later admit that he enjoyed the thrill of his killings, often expressing little remorse for his actions. The need to save patients after inducing their crises was not out of compassion, but for the satisfaction of being seen as a hero. In his own mind, Cullen believed he was performing a service, a twisted form of mercy. Charles Cullen's killing spree was eventually uncovered after a persistent investigation was launched in 2003. The investigation began when Amy Loughran, a nurse who worked alongside Cullen, became suspicious of the high number of patient deaths that seemed to occur during his shifts. Loughran, who was also a close friend of Cullen's, began to suspect that he was responsible for the deaths when she noticed that patients under his care were experiencing unexplained crises, only to recover when Cullen was present to rescue them. Loughran's suspicions grew as she began to notice a pattern. Cullen was always around when the emergencies occurred. It wasn't until Loughran gathered evidence and contacted authorities that the case finally gained traction. The investigation revealed Cullen's extensive history of suspicious deaths at multiple hospitals over the course of his career. Detectives began to piece together a disturbing timeline of events, eventually leading them to charge Cullen with multiple murders. When Cullen was arrested, he confessed to killing at least 40 patients, though the actual number may be higher. He admitted to injecting patients with lethal doses of medication, often enjoying the act of watching them struggle for life before ultimately dying. Cullen's cold demeanor during his confession revealed the depth of his detachment from the suffering he caused. The trial of Charles Cullen was one of the most high-profile medical serial killer cases in U.S. history. His actions exposed a gaping flaw in the healthcare system, one that allowed him to move from hospital to hospital without being stopped. Despite multiple warnings from staff members about his behavior, Cullen's ability to slip through the cracks of the system enabled him to kill for years without ever being caught. Cullen was eventually convicted of 29 murders and 6 attempted murders, though it's widely believed that he killed many more. His sentence was a life term in prison, with no possibility of parole. His case remains one of the most disturbing examples of a healthcare worker abusing their position of trust and authority to commit murder. The failure of the hospitals to investigate his behavior earlier raised serious questions about the accountability of medical institutions. Charles Cullen's legacy is a dark one, serving as a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk in trusted professions. His case stands as a cautionary tale about the importance of oversight and vigilance in the healthcare system. His ability to manipulate the system and evade detection for so long has had a profound impact on medical protocols, leading to increased efforts to monitor and investigate suspicious deaths in hospitals. For the families of Cullen's victims, the pain of losing their loved ones was compounded by the betrayal of trust from someone who was supposed to save them. Cullen's case remains one of the most horrifying examples of a killer operating within the very system meant to protect and heal. His story serves as a grim reminder that even in places where we expect care, we must always remain vigilant against the potential for abuse and evil hidden in plain sight. Charles Cullen was a quiet monster who killed to end suffering, or so he claimed. Our final killer was a seemingly normal nurse whose motive remains a disturbing mystery and whose victims numbered in the dozens. In a Texas hospital's intensive care unit, the person in charge of saving lives was secretly ending them. Vickie Dawn Jackson was a nurse who worked in a hospital in Tyler, Texas, known for its intensive care unit. On the surface, she appeared to be a dedicated professional, a person who had devoted her life to the care and well-being of others. She had a reputation for being attentive and competent, someone patients and colleagues trusted. In fact, Jackson had been working in healthcare for years, and her professionalism in the field was never questioned by most of those around her. However, what no one knew at the time was that behind the caring persona, Jackson was hiding a sinister secret. Unlike many medical professionals who are driven by compassion, Jackson's reasons for choosing to work in healthcare were deeply disturbed. She found herself in the company of death far too often. But for Jackson, this didn't just mean offering comfort to the dying. Instead, she was driven by a dark need to end the lives of the very people she was supposed to help. Over the course of her career, Jackson would go on to kill at least 10 patients with lethal doses of drugs, leaving a trail of destruction that would remain a horrifying chapter in the history of Texas healthcare. Vickie Dawn Jackson's first known victims were vulnerable patients in the intensive care unit, ICU, of the Texas hospital where she worked. These patients, often already suffering from serious or life-threatening conditions, became targets for Jackson, who saw them as easy prey. She injected her victims with lethal doses of heart-stopping drugs, such as digoxin and heparin, which would either cause sudden heart failure or respiratory arrest. Many of her victims appeared to die from natural complications or the progression of their illnesses, which allowed Jackson to continue her lethal acts undetected. At first, her actions went unnoticed because many of her patients were elderly or critically ill. However, as time passed, hospital staff began to see a disturbing pattern. Patients under Jackson's care seemed to deteriorate rapidly, often for no apparent reason. The more suspicious deaths that occurred on her shifts, the more a few attentive colleagues began to suspect something wasn't right. Jackson's ability to administer lethal doses of drugs and cause sudden crises without raising immediate alarms was chilling. She was always present during the medical emergencies, quickly stepping in to save the patients, thus earning the admiration of her co-workers. However, while Jackson was hailed as a hero for her timely interventions, many of her patients continued to die mysteriously under her watch. As more deaths occurred under Jackson's care, the body count started to rise. While she was responsible for the deaths of at least 10 confirmed victims, there are many more believed to have been affected by her actions, but due to a lack of concrete evidence, they could not be definitively linked to her. The deaths seem to occur in clusters, with several patients dying suddenly and unexpectedly during her shifts. Despite this, hospital administrators and staff did not initially recognize the pattern, and Jackson continued to move through her career without suspicion. Over time, more colleagues began to notice the growing number of deaths. A nurse who worked alongside Jackson, who had been suspicious of the high number of sudden and unexplained deaths, quietly began to keep track of the incidents. She started to notice that the deaths occurred disproportionately during Jackson's shifts. Her suspicions grew as she saw a pattern that others had overlooked. Jackson was often in the room when the patient's conditions deteriorated, and she was the one to perform life-saving procedures. Yet these interventions never seemed to prevent the final outcome: death. It wasn't until the hospital staff began to investigate the number of deaths that the horrifying truth started to come to light. Jackson had been operating in plain sight, undetected for so long, taking advantage of the system's flaws and the vulnerability of her patients. When Jackson was finally arrested, the truth about her motives was as chilling as her actions. Her reasoning for committing the murders was deeply disturbing. Jackson claimed that she killed her patients because she wanted to relieve their suffering, but her actions did not reflect mercy. Rather, they were motivated by a perverse sense of control and power. What made Jackson's case particularly haunting was the complete lack of remorse she displayed. During the investigation and trial, she admitted to her crimes, but her justification was that the patients were suffering, and that her actions were in some way an act of compassion. This twisted logic, believing she was relieving suffering by causing death, made her case one of the most psychologically chilling in recent healthcare history. Psychologists later suggested that Jackson may have been suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental disorder in which a caregiver harms those under their care to gain attention or sympathy. However, unlike some other cases, Jackson's motivations seem to be more rooted in the desire for control over life and death, with little to no concern for the actual well-being of the patients. The investigation into Jackson's crimes began in earnest after a nurse who worked alongside her noticed the suspicious nature of the deaths. As she gathered evidence, other hospital staff began to connect the dots, and it became apparent that something was seriously wrong. The police were called in, and as they examined hospital records and spoke to colleagues, the scale of Jackson's actions became clearer. Jackson was arrested in 2000 after it was confirmed that she had been directly responsible for the deaths of at least 10 patients. Authorities discovered that she had been injecting her victims with lethal doses of drugs, often in a way that would initially make the deaths appear to be natural or related to underlying health conditions. When questioned, Jackson was cold and unremorseful, admitting to her actions but showing little to no regret. Her lack of empathy for the lives she had taken was chilling. She claimed that she had been helping the patients by ending their suffering, but it was clear that her true motive was much darker. She craved the attention she received for saving her patients, making her a hero in the eyes of her colleagues. In 2001, Vickie Dawn Jackson was convicted of killing 10 patients and attempting to kill several others. The trial was a highly publicized event, as Jackson's case exposed the serious vulnerabilities in the healthcare system. Hospital staff had failed to recognize the warning signs, and Jackson had been able to move from one facility to another, leaving a trail of death behind her. Jackson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, where she remains today. Her case raised significant questions about the oversight of healthcare workers, particularly those who have direct access to patients' care and medications. The fact that someone could slip through the cracks and carry out such horrifying crimes over an extended period is a grim reminder of how easily trust can be abused in medical settings. The legacy of Vickie Dawn Jackson is one of betrayal and horror. Her case serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of overlooking patterns of suspicious behavior within the healthcare system. Jackson's ability to continue her work while leaving a trail of death is a chilling example of how a killer can operate in plain sight, hidden behind the veil of trust that comes with working in the medical field. For the families of Jackson's victims, the tragedy was compounded by the realization that the person they trusted to care for their loved ones was the one who ended their lives. Jackson's story also serves as a cautionary tale for healthcare institutions, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, proper checks and balances, and timely investigations to prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. Her case remains a terrifying example of a killer hiding in plain sight, and it highlights the ongoing need for scrutiny and accountability in healthcare settings. The legacy of Vickie Dawn Jackson will forever be a reminder of the dark side of human nature and the profound damage that can be done when trust is betrayed by those sworn to protect life. Vickie Dawn Jackson's crimes stand as a final, chilling reminder of the dark potential hiding behind a white coat. She was a woman who was trusted to heal but chose to harm, leaving behind a legacy of pain and a question that will always haunt us. just how many of these angels of death are hiding in plain sight. And that concludes our series on the angels of death. But what happens when the killer isn't a trusted caregiver, but a family member, a wife, a sister, or a mother? In our next series, we'll dive into the terrifying world of the Black Widows, women who kill for love, or more often, for money. Join us next time for the story of the giggling granny, Nanny Doss. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, Unforeseen Fates, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into a different type of killer. And let us know in the comments, which of these cases did you find the most chilling? Your feedback helps us decide what to cover next.